Inflation is a very widely discussed and known phenomenon. All of us talk about inflation. However, as popular the notion is, it is equally controversial. For developing an understanding of inflation, the following dimensions need to be emphasized: the concept of inflation, the classification of inflation, the basic theory of inflation, and the measurement of inflation. The concept of inflation begins by the very obvious word, that is price. In general, when we talk about inflation, we talk about price rise. Well, this is a very simplistic understanding of what inflation stands for. Firstly, when inflation is measured, it is actually measured and understood as a rate. Therefore, it is simplistic to talk only in terms of the level of price or even in terms of rise in price. Therefore, inflation actually refers to the rate at which prices are rising. Another aspect of the concept of inflation is that in the context of the economy, we are not really talking about any single or individual price. That is, we are not referring to the price of a particular commodity. In the macro sense, price implies the general price level. And when we talk of the general price level, this would include the prices of all commodities as well as services. So, therefore, in practical terms, when we talk about inflation and when we refer to a rise in the general price level, we are really not talking about relative price. This is a basic difference between the microeconomic concept of price and the macroeconomic concept of price. In the case of the microeconomic context, it is a relative price, often in relation to other commodities. In the case of the macro meaning of inflation, it is a general price level which takes into account the prices of all goods and services produced in an economy. Hence, the problem in a practical sense is to add up the prices of different commodities and, as I said, including even services. So, therefore, this leads to a major problem of measurement. Now, first of all, as we have said earlier also, we are looking into 4 dimensions: the concept, the classification, the theory and measurement. So, now we go on to the classification of inflation. There are various ways in which inflation has been classified. Very often this is referred to as the types of inflation, but when we call it types of inflation, it does not tell us about the multiplicity of the bases on which these types are classified. Therefore, I would prefer to call this classification of inflation, because there are different bases on which the classification exists. First of all, we can classify inflation on the basis of degree. This, in a popular sense, there are 3 levels or 3 degrees by which inflation is measured. Moderate inflation refers to a mild or low degree of inflation, and this is often called creeping inflation. Typically, this is the characteristic of some of the developed economies like United States, where the rate of inflation has always been just in the range of about 2 to 3%. Then we have something called galloping inflation, which is also called double digit inflation, because the rate of inflation goes beyond the ordinary single digits, like let us say 6% or 8%, and it crosses 10%, it may be 12% or 15%. Beyond this, sometimes some of the economies have experienced extremely high rates of inflation, and this is known as hyperinflation. This happens when the inflation goes beyond 2 digits and might go beyond even 100%. It may be something like 112%. Okay? So, under such circumstances, you could imagine how the value of the currency depreciates, falls in by leaps and bounds. So, therefore, this is one way of looking at inflation. The second type of classification is based on the degree of control. We could talk about two types of inflation over here. Open inflation is referred to, inflation is referred to as open inflation when there is no control on the economy, and inflation floats by itself. The second type of inflation under this classification is called suppressed inflation. In the case of suppressed inflation, the government exercises certain controls in terms of price controls or quantitative controls, etc. And the third basis is on the basis of time period. This is more by observation, that is, that we find certain patterns in inflation which emerge at different points of time in history. For example, wartime inflation is one kind, post-war inflation shows some other characteristics, and peacetime inflation, or you could call it interwar inflation, shows other characteristics. And the third basis upon which we can classify inflation is on the basis of expectations. Basically, expectations play a role in inflation. There is something called anticipated and unanticipated inflation. People's expectations influence the nature of inflation. It is obvious that certain factors like speculation play a role in this case. Then we have also the last kind of basis of inflation, which is called inflation based on the nature of the cause. And this is very important because we could have inflation caused by scarcity, we could have inflation caused by pricing power, that means monopoly power, and then we could have sector specific inflation, because in certain sectors there may be certain bottlenecks of supply and so on, and that brings us on to another kind of inflation based on cause, and this is a very important dimension. We call it demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation is based on the causes which arise out of escalation of demand, and on the other hand, causes which push up the cost and price of raw materials and inputs and other factors of production. Ultimately, of course, demand pull and cost push inflation sometimes reinforce each other, and then we have a very complex form of inflation called wage price spiral. There is no universally accepted definition of inflation. In a broad sense, there is considerable and consistent increase in the general price level over a period of time, it is known as inflation. However, the term consistent and considerable is not precisely defined. Due to inflation, the value of money reduces uh, as too much money is actually chasing very few goods. This is a often stated statement. It occurs throughout the economy. This is one characteristic of inflation. During the same period, the prices of many items in the basket of consumption rise, and therefore there is a rise in what we call the general price level over a period of time because of a continuous growth in demand. This creates an excess demand over the existing supply of goods and services. This is known as demand pull inflation. A rise in the prices are an important attribute of inflation, but every rise in price is not inflation. Inflation must be distinguished from a simple price rise of a specific good or service. As we have discussed, this would be the case when the relative price of a particular good or service increases. For example, if we talk about the labor market, suppose we find that the price of some kind of labor, that is skilled labor like a welder, if the wage rate increases, then we cannot call this inflation unless in general in the whole economy wages increase and the prices of inputs increase. Unless this happens, we cannot refer to it as inflation. So, therefore, an important attribute of inflation is that there should be a increase in the average price level and not an increase of the price of a specific good or service. If the price of goods and services increase because of an increase in the cost of production, now the cost of production over here has two components broadly. On the one hand, we have factors of production, and on the other hand, we have other inputs like materials, we have energy and so on, and sometimes there specifically it could also have to do with say imported raw materials. So, when any of these things increase, again not as individual prices but in general, then what happens is that the cost price structure in the economy becomes a high cost price structure. So, therefore, we say that on the one hand there could be many factors by which the demand in the economy increases, and for some reason there is a supply bottleneck, and this leads to demand pull inflation. On the other hand, it could be that the origin of inflation takes place from the fact that there are supply bottlenecks, and in addition to that there is a push from the supply side. The cost and price structure goes on increasing, and when the cost in one part of the economy, in one segment of the economy increases, this feeds the increase in the cost of production in other parts. So, therefore, this results in the cost push inflation. So, these are the two most important types of inflation: demand pull inflation and cost push inflation.
The characteristics of inflation are: inflation is associated with the rise in general price level. During inflation, there is excessive supply of money. Inflation causes the value of money to decline, and the inflationary spiral has a tendency to feed upon itself. During inflation, there is increase in spending and decrease in savings. Inflation is different from increase in price of specific goods and services. There is cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Economists categorize inflation on different bases, which are on the basis of degree, on the basis of degree of control, on the basis of time period, on the basis of expectation, and on the basis of cause of inflation. Like a disease, inflation exhibits different levels of severity. On the basis of rate or the degree of speed at which price rises, inflation is categorized as moderate inflation, galloping inflation, and hyperinflation. Moderate inflation. This inflation is also called creeping inflation when there is a tendency of the general price level to increase at a moderate rate over a long period of time. It is termed as moderate or creeping inflation. This is the mildest form of inflation and is not dangerous for an economy. This inflation is predictable and is characterized by a single digit annual rate of inflation. In this form of inflation, people trust money, have faith in the monetary system, and confidence in money as a store of value because money retains its value from month to month and year to year. Galloping inflation. This form of inflation is very common in countries suffering from weak government, war, or revolution. When the rate of inflation is very high, it is known as galloping inflation, but the term very high is not precisely defined. Therefore, an inflation that ranges in double digit or triple digit range of 20, 100, or 400% per year is called galloping inflation. In this form of inflation, people lose confidence in money and hold only a minimum amount of money to meet their day to day requirements. Hyperinflation. When there is an increase in the general price level that can only be described at more than three-digit rate per annum, it is called hyperinflation. It reflects the highest degree of abnormality in the economic system of the country. In this form of inflation, people do not have confidence in money and paper currency loses all of its value. During 1922 and 1923, Germany faced hyperinflation when at one time prices rose by 1 million times the pre war level of price. This inflation can be seen when people carried full baskets of money to the market and bought goods back in their pockets. On the basis of degree of control or the reaction of the government to inflation, inflation can be categorized as open and suppressed inflation. Open inflation, suppressed inflation. Open inflation. When there is no reaction by the government to control inflation and prices are free to find their own level, it is known as open inflation. This is a rare phenomenon in the modern world economy. In the free market economy, open inflation occurs. Suppressed inflation. When the price rise is controlled by the government through the fixation of price ceiling, subsidization of commodities, rationing, and also through its monetary and fiscal control measures, it is termed as suppressed inflation. When the government removes its control from inflation, it becomes open inflation. In suppressed inflation, inflation occurs but at a rate lower than open inflation. Black marketing, corruption, artificial scarcity, etc., are the consequences of suppressed inflation. India facing inflation is a good example of suppressed inflation. Wartime inflation. Inflation that occurs at the time of warlike situation is called wartime inflation. During the period of war, the government increases its expenditure on defense items which are of unproductive nature. Due to this, the resources are diverted and there is shortage of resources to produce essential commodities. By this, the soaring demand of the people cannot be met by the supply, and consequently, inflation occurs. The prices of essential goods keep on rising in the market during the war period, resulting in wartime inflation. Post war inflation. The average increase in the prices of goods and services soon after a war is known as post war inflation. The increase in price is more than the increase that occurred during the war as the government relaxes its control. Peacetime inflation. The average increase in the price of goods and services that occurs during a normal period of time is called peacetime inflation. On the basis of expectation. Inflation on the basis of expectations or predictions of people is categorized as anticipated and unanticipated inflation. Anticipated inflation, unanticipated inflation. Anticipated inflation. If the rate of inflation corresponds to the expectation or prediction or anticipation of a majority of people, then it is called anticipated or expected inflation. Unanticipated inflation. If the rate of inflation does not correspond to the expectation or prediction or anticipation of a majority of people, then it is called unanticipated or unexpected inflation. On the basis of the factors that causes inflation, inflation is divided into the following categories: scarcity inflation, pricing power inflation, sectoral inflation, demand pull inflation, and cost push inflation. Scarcity inflation. When inflation occurs due to hoarding, it is called scarcity inflation. Hoarding is the excess accumulation of basic commodities by black marketers. The purpose is to create an artificial shortage of basic food grains, kerosene, etc., so that they can sell them at a high price and be able to make huge profits. Pricing power inflation. When the industries and business houses increase the price of a product so that there is a huge profit for them, inflation that occurs in the economy is called pricing power inflation. This inflation is also called the oligopolistic inflation because the oligopolies have the ability to set the prices of their goods and services. Financial crisis and economic depression are not the cause of this inflation. Sectoral inflation. When there is a rise in the price of goods and services produced by a specific sector of the industry, the inflation occurred is called sectoral inflation. The increase in the price of crude oil is an example of sectoral inflation. Demand pull inflation. The increase in price of goods and services because of factors such as increase in income, rise in population, etc., which causes the aggregate demand to rise, is called demand pull inflation. Due to the increase in demand, the existing supply is not able to meet the demand, and there is excess demand in the economy, which causes the price of goods and services to rise. Cost push inflation. The increase in price of goods and services due to the rising cost of production is called cost push inflation. For example, if there is an increase in the wages paid to the workers, then in order to meet the increased cost of production, the producer will raise the price of the ultimate product, which causes inflation.
Let us now discuss the concept of inflationary gap. Classical economists regarded supply of money as the main cause of inflation. Keynes, on the other hand, argued that inflation occurred because of an increase in the aggregate demand. This means that, according to Keynes, inflation was demand driven, and according to uh, classicals, basically the cause was seen as an excess of money supply. In the context of Keynes, demand does not signify the ordinary notion of demand. Demand implies effective demand, and effective demand, as you know, is defined as consumption expenditure plus investment expenditure plus government expenditure and expenditure by foreigners on domestic exports. So, therefore, keeping this in mind, if we would now like to discuss inflationary gap, then we can't do so without referring to Keynes's own work called How to Pay for the War. In 1940, Keynes showed how an inflationary gap arises, particularly in the context of a war economy. Inflationary gap can be viewed as the excess of aggregate demand over the full employment level of supply. Inflationary gap points out to the fact that at the full employment level, the aggregate output would be at the maximum. The entire installed capacity would be utilized, and at this point the potential output would be equal to the actual demand if full employment exists and if there is no excess of aggregate demand. However, the moment the economy goes beyond full employment, the aggregate demand outstrips the aggregate supply at the full employment level. This leads to excess of aggregate demand over the full employment level of supply, and this gap is known as the inflationary gap. Now, if before full employment, suppose some of the resources are underutilized, then according to the Keynesian theory, there is an assumption called downward rigidity of prices. What happens is that below full employment level, the price level is rigid, therefore, neither does the price level increase nor does it decrease. Whatever happens to the price level in a Keynesian economy happens only after the full employment level. Therefore, inflationary gap exists only after full employment. Before full employment, there is no inflation, and after full employment, there is no unemployment. In the Keynesian sense, therefore, the two phenomena of inflation and unemployment do not coexist.
The aggregate demand is represented on the vertical axis, whereas income or output is represented on the horizontal axis. The 45-degree line shows the aggregate supply by the economy. C represents consumption expenditure, I represents investment expenditure, and G represents government expenditure. So, the total expenditure or the effective demand by the economy is represented by C plus I plus G function. Initially, the equilibrium output is YF, which is also the full employment level of output, represented by the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve at point B. Suppose there is an increase in aggregate demand by the economy. This increase is shown by an upward shift of the aggregate demand curve C plus I plus G to C plus I plus G plus delta G. By this, there is an excess demand represented by AB. The excess demand at full employment level of output is represented by AB, which is actually the inflationary gap. Thus, when the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate output at the full employment level, the inflationary gap exists. Increase in rates of taxes and reduction in government expenditure are the measures that the government can take to wipe out the inflationary gap and thereby prevent further price rise. In order to explain the causes of inflation, we need to measure the extent of inflation. Price indices and the GDP deflator are the two most commonly used methods to measure inflation. Price indices. The statistics that measures the change in a variable over a period of time is called indices. For the measurement of inflation, the variable is price. For measuring annual inflation, the purpose is to measure change in price over a period of 12 months. The rate of inflation is equal to Pt minus Pt minus 1 divided by Pt minus 1 into 100. Pt is equal to price index number of the year selected for the measurement of inflation, and Pt minus 1 is equal to the price index number in the preceding year. Price index is also calculated by establishing some base price and comparing the base price with the prices 12 months ago and with current year prices. The price in the base period is always assumed to be 100. Suppose we take 2000 to 2001 as base year and the inflation rate for the current year 2010 to 2011 is 115, and for the year 2009 to 2010 it is 112, then we can say that inflation was 12% over the 9-year period to 12 months ago, that is 112 minus 100. Inflation was 15% over the 10-year period to now, that is 115 minus 100. Inflation was 2.7% over 12 months period to now, that is 115 minus 112 oblique 112 multiplied by 100. Price indices removes the effect of inflation from calculations as it adjusts the market or current prices to real terms. The awareness of the operation of price indices is very crucial as it is integral to the proper understanding of economic trends over time. The two commonly used price indices are Consumer Price Index and Wholesale Price Index, also called the Producer Price Index. Consumer Price Index, an index used to measure the changes in the average price of consumer goods and services, is called Consumer Price Index. It is used to measure the change in the cost of living. It is a fixed quantity price index. By keeping track of the changes in the price of a specified basket of consumer goods and services, and by observing the changes in this index, inflation can be measured. There is a lot of month to month variation in the prices of food and energy. When the change in the price of food and energy is excluded from the all inclusive consumer price index, we will get the core inflation rate. This hopes to get a more accurate monthly reading of consumer price trends. Wholesale price index or producer price index. It is used to measure the changes in the average price of goods that are traded in the wholesale market. Thus, it reflects the general rate of inflation. In India, wholesale price index is used to indicate the rate of inflation in the economy. Generally, the consumer price index and the producer price index reflect the same rate of inflation over a long period of time. Whereas in the short run, producer price index changes before the change in consumer price index because the increase in price by the producer takes some time to be reflected in the price paid by the consumer. Therefore, in order to have a clue regarding the changes in consumer prices, the producer price index is watched closely. GDP deflator. It is an index that is used to measure inflation by considering all the goods and services included in GDP. It is expressed as a ratio of nominal GDP to the real GDP of the same year. GDP deflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Nominal GDP is the current value of output, whereas real GDP is the inflation adjusted value of output.
Now let us consider and recapitulate whatever we have learnt in this module. The increase in the general price level is called inflation. It reduces the value of money because there is too much of money to buy too few goods. There are different aspects of inflation, and inflation is categorized and classified on different bases. First of all, inflation can be classified on the basis of the rate of inflation or the degree of inflation. It is categorized in terms of moderate, galloping and hyperinflation. Moderate is the inflation is the mildest form of inflation. Galloping inflation is when the inflation goes into 2 digits, and hyperinflation is when the inflation rate goes even above that. When the currency loses all of its value, and it has often been said that in some of these countries where hyperinflation took place, people have quoted that people used to take baskets of currencies to even buy a loaf of bread. So this is called hyperinflation. Then another classification is on the basis of control. If the government imposes controls, then it is known as suppressed inflation. If there are no controls, then it is known as open inflation. Now, on the basis of the time period also, inflation can be described. So, we would have something like wartime inflation, post-war inflation and peacetime inflation. Another way of describing or classifying inflation is on the basis of expectations. Anticipated and unanticipated. That is, if the economic agents anticipate inflation, then this has a different implication for inflation, and if they do not, then it has a different implication for inflation. And then we can classify inflation on the basis of causes. It can be categorized in terms of scarcity inflation, power inflation, pricing power inflation, sectoral inflation, demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Keynes explained the concept of inflationary gap, where he said that at the full employment level of output, which is known as the potential level of demand, the gap between the actual demand and the potential demand, where the actual demand is greater than the potential demand. is explained and measured as the inflationary gap. In this context, one observation is that according to the Keynesian system of analysis, uh, inflationary gap indicates that unemployment and inflation cannot coexist. Price indices like GDP deflator are used for measuring inflation. There are two types of price indices, the wholesale price index and the consumer price index. So, basically in the case of the GDP deflator, uh, GDP can be measured both in at constant prices and in current prices. So, the ratio of the GDP measured at constant prices to that of current prices, constant prices, indicates the ratio which is called the GDP deflator. This apart, as we have said, consumer price index and the wholesale price index. These are the two commonly used price indices.